Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you, Linda, for having Ocean Spray here today. We're thrilled to be part of this. It's such an important initiative. And I know for those of you who may not know, Ocean Spray is actually a farmer owned cooperative. In fact, one of our original founders was a woman. And 90 years ago, she teamed up with two partners creating Ocean Spray, really on the principle that we're better, we're smarter, we're more creative. And I think most importantly, we're stronger when we're working together. And now more than ever, we absolutely have to work together. I think as a business, as individuals, each of us needs to do our part. And that is what Ocean Spray believes in. And we believe in conversations like this and convenings like this to help all of us come together and do just that. And that collaboration, that ingenuity, that innovation, and making really shaping, as you said, for this event, shaping the future. That is what folks like this are doing on the call. So we're thrilled to be here. Thank you again on behalf of our cooperative. My thanks to the Globe, as well as to you, Linda and Samantha. I'm so looking forward to hearing this conversation. So my thanks, and we're thrilled to be part of this.
Thank you to Ocean Spray. And I think they have a quick video.
Farmers don't talk very much. They speak with their hands to help with the harvest, nourish their community, and feed the world. We know actions speak louder than words. Increasing wages to essential workers, donating meals to those in need, keeping grocery shelves full, driving the supply chain forward, doing our part. Here's to the farmer and all of us.
That was a beautiful video. Thank you, Ocean Spray, for presenting the special event series along with support from Cross Insurance. Bringing women together who are setting the agenda for our region and shaping its future is a mission that's close to my heart, and I couldn't be happier to be leading this conversation today. Now, welcome, Samantha. I have so many questions for you, and we already had some really great questions submitted from the audience, and we'll get to those at the end. We'll have time to address those. Welcome. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here. I'm thrilled you're doing this series. I feel like I wish when I was before I was entering the bowels of the U.S. government that such a series had existed, and I could have just binged on this instead of the Queen's Gambit and Peaky Blinders. But it's great you're doing it, and congrats on breaking another glass ceiling for the rest of us at the Globe. And thanks for bringing Alex Cora back. I know that's a controversial statement, but I do have to. We have to start with our baseball foundations.
Oh, great. Thank you. And Samantha, you and I have had the opportunity to talk before, and we had a really great conversation about your memoir, which to everybody watching today, this is one of the most fantastic memoirs I've read, because it is not only your journey and this inside look of what it's like inside government and sort of the soul of so many in politics today, and what it's like to be a UN ambassador and all that insight, but it's also an incredibly rich personal journey of growth and conviction. And so I'm so thrilled you put it out in the world. And I want to start with some questions here, and then we're going to get to the present day. And we're all going to try and ask what role you're going to take, if you're going to take a role in the new administration. But we'll start with you and your journey, which you detail in such loving, such sort of empathetic and understanding way in your memoir. Is that you were born in Ireland and you immigrated to the US when you were 9 years old, and you found this wonderful refuge in sports in order to fit in as this girl who was sort of a fish out of water in this new land, and you spoke differently and whatnot. You found this way to connect to sports, and it was such a big part of your life for so long.
I was waiting. I thought you were gonna take me all the way through to the present. I was like,
no, it's up there.
It's like a really interesting story. I was getting a little mesmerized by it. No, I did. I moved. My mother left Ireland in 1979 and moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She left Ireland with a guy who wasn't my dad. My father was a big drinker, as was an affliction that affected many families in Ireland. Of course, not only there, everywhere. But there was no divorce back then, if you can believe it, for the women. All the women watching, crazy to think that as recently as then, indeed as recently as the early 1990s, you could not get a divorce if your marriage wasn't working out in Ireland. Uh, at that time, when we came to America, you couldn't get contraception, you certainly couldn't, there was no freedom of choice or anything resembling it. That just passed recently in a referendum. So it was different, and the church was very powerful, partly in order to be able to, have the relationship that she sought, partly because she was as sort of an insurgent woman in a very male-dominated field, medicine. She'd gone to medical school really late, having had her male teachers tell her it's not for women, it's not for women. And in Ireland, it was even further behind the US in those regards. But she'd broken through, loved it. She's in kidney transplants. She's working in Mount Sinai in New York today, and you can imagine she's 76, but even with COVID, working as if she was just starting out her career and with the same enthusiasm. I think I write in the book that she's one of those people who kind of, you almost feel like she's skipping to work. That's kind of the vibe that she's given me most of her life, or most of my life with her. So she moves us to America. She has to redo everything in terms of her certification, her residency, and all of that. So we're a little, just an immigrant story of just starting over and not having much in the way of money or anything. And so I didn't have any clothes, other than what I brought from Ireland from my Catholic school. So I show up at this Pittsburgh school in my little plaid skirt and my patent leather shoes and my lace stockings and my cardigan, my, forest green cardigan from Mount Anvil School. And I noticed, that at least the boys, all they were talking about the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Pittsburgh Steelers. And so I came home and I said, we have to go to Kaufman's and get me a Pirates t-shirt and a Steelers t-shirt. And then I had to learn the rules of these new games and so forth. So it was my way of fitting in, and it worked. I was within a year, I had a wad of Big League Chew in my mouth, and I was imitating the players with their tobacco, and I loved playing, and I loved talking about professional sports. I ended up going to high school in Georgia. My mother ended up marrying the man she came with. He's my stepfather. I write about him at length in the book. He's a complete character, and my love of storytelling and character portraits comes probably from him more than anything. And what had seemed like a temporary move, maybe for her to get some exposure to transplant medicine or to get a divorce eventually and to be able to remarry, became this mission creep where just one year begat the next. And so I went to high school in Georgia and played a lot of sports, read everything there was about sports, but somehow got into Yale University. That was the first, other than coming to America, basically the first American huge break that I got. And you can imagine the exposures I got there. But what did I do, Linda, my first year? I had a sports talk show on the radio where I was one of, a handful of people who just sounded off. And you know what talk radio is like. I mean, nobody should be part of that world if they can help it. But there I was at Yale, and that's what I was doing. But the summer after my freshman year, and I tell the story in the book, and I would tell it to you now, even though because you've read the book, it, because I think there's a truth to it, which I'll come to, that is pretty universalizable. But I was sitting in the CBS sports department, or as an intern, taking notes on a Atlanta Braves baseball game, so I could cut the sports highlights for the evening news. And on the CBS live news feed came footage from Beijing, China, from Tiananmen Square. And I had vaguely known, again, stuff seeps into our minds that we don't even know that we're taking on board. But being at Yale, of course, everybody other than me was very political and socially aware. And so I would have had some sense that there was some churn. And this was, of course, before the Berlin Wall fell, just a handful of months, five months before that. So it was would prove a very important year, 1989. But what I saw, just by coincidence, I happened to be in the booth the day that the Chinese government, having allowed these protests to go for many days, decided to crack down. So what I saw was tanks mowing over young people my age, kids who were just out there, university students, workers, who were just asking for basic liberalization. And it had a real effect on me. But the reason I say it's a kind of universalizable story is I think the dimension of it that is most important is not that it was an epiphany where I then said, one day I'm going to be US ambassador to the United Nations, or I'm going to become even something lesser than that. I'm going to be a human rights lawyer. I mean, that would have been like saying, I'm going to be this, the #1 starter for the Boston Red Sox. It was so far removed from what I would have been capable of even imagining for myself. And so I say this almost as a permission structure for maybe for myself, even now, for my kids, for people listening, because, I think that sometimes we look at other people's lives and we think, oh, it was so inexorable. It was so, you, Linda, were destined to shatter this glass ceiling and become this incredibly impactful, businesswoman. And there's serendipity along the way, but people's epiphanies don't often come in these large kind of lightning bolts. They come in more gradual ways. And for me, it was simply, I need to learn more about what's going on in the world. And I need to be okay with the fact that I don't know a lot, because I'm going to feel really dumb. I feel really smart talking about RBIs and ERA and wins above replacement. I felt really like you get comfortable where you are, but to go someplace new and kind of admit, I know there's something going on in Beijing and I know the regime's not great, but I'm not exactly, and so I ended my subscription to USA Today, where I would clip the red section. Do you remember the red sports section? I would shake the rest into the recycling bin. And I subscribed to the New York Times, and I would underline the New York Times, the names of like heads of state. And I knew geography really well, because in Ireland, it's in your DNA that you're going to have to leave someday. And so every Irish person is great at geography. So I knew geography, but everything else, the history, the politics, it was all new to me. But that was a threshold moment, because it was about being okay, being new, being okay, feeling dumb, being okay, facing these large gaps and being vulnerable. Fundamentally, it's like any leadership lesson about vulnerability, I guess. And then that would just, once I then, jumped into that new pool, in the deep end, then it was just so fascinating. It was riveting. And then you gradually do amass a little bit of knowledge, and you travel more and you get a little bit of specialized knowledge. And even if you don't know everything, you know a little bit more than you once knew about something. And so that was a really foundational experience for me, less the moment in the booth and more the outgrowth of it. And you still, even 3 years after the Tiananmen event for me, which was, of course, not for me what it was for the people who were brutalized, but I still wouldn't have said, I'm going to have a career in foreign policy, or I still wouldn't have even self-identified as a human rights person or someone. It just seemed like that there was still that class of people who were very virtuous and knew a lot more than I did. And so I say that because I think a lot of people think, oh, that's you who does, who cares about social justice, or and the truth is that hankering lies, I think, in so many people, but they either are afraid of being new and vulnerable again, or often they just feel that it's not that they don't want to make a difference, but they're nervous that they can't, that there's no obvious pathway really. And just to say that's how all of us feel. And so the feature of the book that I think is the most important is not just describing what happens, but describing one's insides and what's going on in oneself, because people are going to be able to identify with that much more than Tiananmen or baseball or becoming a war correspondent or being a diplomat. It's the inner life and the inner doubts and imposter syndromes, especially for women. I think that's what creates a kind of universal connection with a reader and with a friend.
And I'm so glad that you were able to tell sort of the full context behind it. And I wanted to start with the sports for exactly what you highlighted, is that if I looked at you now, I would say, oh gosh, she must have planned from the beginning that she wanted to have this, passion for international and really have an impact in the world in this way. But it was actually you were really passionate about sports, and you were pursuing that. And you have throughout your entire life this just sort of this curiosity that's just pushed you. You were in this booth, this sort of pivotal moment where you were in the booth and you saw this and you didn't understand it, and it awoke something inside of you that you didn't realize was in there, but you listened to. You listened to this thing that told you, I don't like this and I need to understand why, and can I help? And it's this really interesting sort of thing that's driven you, this curiosity, this saying yes, and this sort of drive to help that sort of carried you throughout your career.
Yeah, when I look back for the purposes of writing a memoir, and I should say that I was very sheepish. I've gotten used to it now that I've been talking about it and talking about myself. But there's a saying that Irish people have trouble using the first person even in therapy, and that was kind of what I lived through as I tried to make meaning of things that I had just kind of roller coastered through. But I think that this both the serendipity of it all, but also the modesty of ambition along the way. And I don't mean that as a compliment to myself, but more just that for example, one of the things that I realized only when I went back over my life was that when I was at a career crossroads, as maybe some of the people on this call are, there are a lot of different ways to weigh what you should do with yourself. And for whatever reason, and I don't know if this is my mother's influence or a particular teacher, but something in me from early developed this kind of framework, and I call it the X test in the book. But I was really struck at how often it popped up without me being self-aware as I went that this was happening. But the X test is simply, when at a juncture, to ask oneself, if all I get out of this is X, and then fill in the blank, will it have been worth it? And so talk about modesty of ambition, that's kind of the minimalist account. So it's not, if I go get this internship, will I one day be able to work at the White House, when you're in your early 20s? No. And by the way, a lot of my students, my Harvard students, do it that bigger way, right? Of like, if I do this, will I then one day get to be this ambassador to them? I'm like, no. Let's growth mindset, as we parents like to say. So what will you take away? If all you do is this and it leads nowhere, how will you be different on the other side of that experience? And so after college, I was really fortunate enough to luck into an internship in Washington. It went really well. I was the sort of assistant coffee pourer mainly, but also editing, occasionally doing some research for a US diplomat who had just retired, who'd been ambassador to Turkey and Thailand, my mentor, who's a big character in the book. And yet one of the things he was passionate about was what was happening in Bosnia, the genocide that was unfolding, in the heart of Europe, 40 plus years after the Holocaust. And just by virtue of being his assistant, I had to get smart enough to know what was happening there. So it was another area of just not knowing anything and then trying to dive deep. But at the end of it, at the end of the internship, I could have stayed in Washington. I could have worked for him in a real job. But I was longing, to your point about curiosity, I was longing to learn more. And I thought, and I was longing to be able to do something more than kind of as what Obama would call it later, admiring the problem, which is a common feature of one's response to really complex things. And there's nothing I, as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old could do about the war in Bosnia as such, but I wanted to do something. And, but I then was faced with the decision through a friend, will I go over to the Balkans and try to make it as a freelance journalist? And incidentally, of course, my number one publication and my number one sort of quasi sponsor was the Boston Globe. I was the stringer for the Boston Globe. In those times I would become that. But if I said to myself, if I go and become a freelance journalist, one day I'll be the Boston Globe's Europe correspondent or Beijing correspondent, or I get to cover the Red Sox. If I said that, forget it, you can't, there's too many variables. There's too much out of your control. So it's just much more simple. If all that I get out of this experience is I learn Serbo-Croatian, this pretty obscure language I probably won't use anywhere else, but still that would be a formidable, it was then called Serbo-Croatian, it's now Serbian, Croatian, etc. That would have been worth it. If I see the UN, because by now I'm interested in foreign affairs, if I see the UN in action up close and can understand better, UN peacekeeping, and in the wake of the Cold War, the the new US-Russia relationship, I've just come out of then getting immersed in studying history and foreign policy. Wouldn't it be worth it if I could earn enough through my pieces just to learn? Now, provided I don't, get injured or die in a war, right? There's that caveat, which my mother was quick to remind me of. But it's such a minimalist thing. It's like if all I do is learn the language, it's a year of my life, maybe it's two, but that'd be amazing, right? And similarly, pretty much every other big career move was that way of formulating the question, rather than some notion of this as a springboard to something else, but like very rooted in how will I evolve and grow, and are there new skills I can get out of it, that one day when I do know what I want, that maybe I'd be able to harness them for.
It's a wonderful philosophy of again that you've brought throughout your career, of also growing and challenging yourself. And you were a very brave journalist in Bosnia, and you sort of took that as far as you could. You realize that a lot of journalists measure their impact by where in the paper they're placed, but you were measuring your impact. Well, why didn't Clinton respond? I mean, isn't Clinton reading this? Why doesn't he understand what I understand here? And you realize that in order to continue, you did have to go back to school. And so you used this time in school to write a Pulitzer Prize winning book that really catapulted. So you took this experience that you had, even though you were frustrated, you sort of kept going and brought everything that you had learned with you to be able to tell this story, to have impact.
I did, although again, I didn't, that is right. That is the retrospective account of what happened.
You didn't say I'm going to write a Pulitzer.
But the prospective account, which is how life is lived, was I'm in law school, I'm miserable. All my friends are back in Bosnia. I'd been so frustrated that everything we wrote, I was by then writing not only for the Globe, but for the Washington Post and the Economist, and that it just felt to be like it was landing on deaf ears. And that's how I ended up moving to the Boston area. In fact, was out of that sense of frustration and just describing the symptoms of a problem and not having any wherewithal to be able to help the people whose stories I was telling, kind of giving up a little bit on the U.S. and whether it was going to really assert itself and try to bring the war to an end. So I can't say I left in a huff, but I definitely left sad. I left and sort of maybe beaten, even like just defeated. And I decided to go to law school, as many people who feel defeated do. So that's how I landed here, and somehow got into Harvard Law School. But as I was pulling into campus, the U.S. ended up leading a humanitarian intervention and bringing the war to an end within 2 weeks. And so it turned out that so many of the, these stories that my colleagues and I were writing that were very vivid and really making this effort to bridge the distance between the peoples whose lives were being shattered because of their religion or their ethnicity, to make readers care about those people. It turns out it actually had, over time, a critical mass of people had come to really care, and they put a lot of pressure on the president, and the president ultimately did something that saved tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. But I was in law school when it happened. Like, timing. But while at law school, I then began to process, and probably had a little retrospect PTSD. Just I'd been living under siege in Sarajevo, and it was a grim, particularly that summer right before I came to Boston, arrived on campus. But for a class, I decided to try to put that experience in some context and ask myself, okay, so there was this mass atrocity campaign perpetrated, and I, and many, many other people wrote stories about it. And then there's this American response, but what is the historical story here? How does America generally respond? Was there something exceptional about this? Was it because they were Muslim that we were very slow, or was it because it was after the Cold War? Like, let me do a little amateur historiography here. And I kind of expected that a book like that would have existed, American responses to the major genocides. And there's an amazing literature about the Holocaust and Roosevelt, the abandonment of the Jews. And I was pretty familiar with some of that, but I decided, oh, okay, I'll do that for a class. And then when I went to the stacks, and back when we used to be able to go to libraries and
Beautiful.
marinate in the stacks, there was no such book. And this topic of bystanding, which I came to with this like very austere lens in my, genocide. But the topic of bystanding is just an intrinsically fascinating one, right? Because we're all that, all of us are that at some point, most days, right? There's something that's happening somewhere and we don't feel either equipped to do something about it, we don't have the means to do something about it. And then on our good days, and this concept came to me later, but we're upstanders. Occasionally we will raise our voices, and if somebody's being mistreated in the workplace, or if there is somebody that you can help support in some way. I mean, now, these concepts certainly come to mind in light of how much suffering there is during the pandemic, and the sense that those of us have, how do you help all these people waiting for days, even in some cases, at food banks and so forth. So I think a lot of us live in this question of what are our responsibilities, and where do we live on that bystander, upstander spectrum, and where can one even live and function? Whereas a lot of history is written in terms of perpetrators and villains and victims, and many of us, if we're lucky, don't find ourselves in those categories. And so I was interested in genocide, but I was in a sense more interested in this deeper question. So as a result of all this interest, I ended up leaving law school, and after I wrote a 20-page paper that became like an 80-page paper, and I decided this actually should be a book in and of itself. But had I left law school, Linda, and said, I'm going to spend 5 years working on this book, that's what it's going to take, I would never have crossed that threshold and done it. Instead, I was like, oh, it'll be done, take me 6 months. So 5 years later, I was still working on the book and still trying to answer that question. How has America responded to genocide, and why? And what are the stories we tell ourselves, and what are the broader responsibilities we have? So then the only reason I'm dwelling on the story is because it's, again, how life is lived, I think, for so many of us. I finally got comfortable. I finally think, this is what I have to say on the question. I've talked to 300 officials. I feel like I'm telling this dark story, but through the tale of these upstanders who are risking their careers and their lives to try to help people they don't even know. Like, these are amazing people. I'm going to bring their stories to life. And I actually came to like what I had written, kind of, and then I went out I had a publisher, and then I went with the book to the publisher, and they were like, oh, not so much. And then they said they didn't want to publish it, but I said, no, this is the book it needs to be. It needs to have these characters. It can't be just a history, like an old fashioned, the way these things are usually written. We have to do it this way. So then I went back out on the open market, and nobody wanted to publish the book at all. And so for, I don't know, close to 6 months, I was in this limbo of having spent 5 years having the book, thinking the book, trusting my instinct. That was one good thing, is I did at no point did I think, okay, back to the drawing board. Like, I thought, I think they're not right. I think there's something to this way of doing this that's right. But finally ended up finding a publisher, New Republic Books. They do like very few books each year, and it was an offshoot of the magazine. And they published it, and not only did it kind of catch fire, but it caught fire in a very unusual place, which is college campuses. Huh. And it was around the time of the Iraq War, and young people really grappling with America's role in the world, because it was after 9/11, just after 9/11, but also grappling with who are we, and what are our responsibilities politically, domestically, but also in terms of larger international questions. And so, to my amazement, it just became this like Jack Kerouac-like thing. I don't want to exaggerate it, but I mean, for a nonfiction book, it was young people who and to this day, people I worked with in the Obama administration or even at Harvard, there are people who read it in high school or read it in their freshman year in college. But one adult read it, and that was Barack Obama, the first-term senator, and he was the only senator who reached out to me about it. But that is how my Obama story started as well, is that having had this horrific, kind of up and down publisher tale, it was a book that did get read by some influential people, and he was one of them. And that's in the end how I ended up ultimately working for him when he became president.
One of the great compliments I've heard you give people is that they have curiosity. And one of your great, very diplomatic insults that I've heard you give is somebody lacks curiosity. And you've described Obama in that dinner, which you describe in really great detail in the book of, he said I have 45 minutes and you were there, you closed the place down because he just really wanted to understand. He was a senator, he was a freshman senator, he was sort of new on the stage, but he just had this really deep curiosity and really wanted to understand your thinking and understand and sort of deep thinking that you've had on the subject.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure people are much more interested in Obama and his the way he is kind of up close than me. I think he gives a real glimpse of that in the new book in Promised Land, which I can recommend to everybody. And it's a little intimidating. It's pretty long and it doesn't even get through the first term, but it's a lot of it is poetry. I mean, he is the most beautiful writer and so able to go, and that's a product of his curiosity, because again, if you're a full spectrum curious person as he is, you're seeing way more than, often when we're in a hurry that we see. And so we've never had a president who's making decisions, life and death decisions every day, or figuring out how to work with Mitch McConnell, depending on which you think is more challenging, but who's also noticing the whether a person has sorrowful eyes, or how the sun is setting in the rose garden, or has observations about raising his girls, and then a male culture around the White House. I mean, there's just a level of self-awareness and a curiosity about detail that is, yes, as it happens, reflected in this book, but that was really reflected in that first dinner. And I did want to try to capture that, because once someone has become an icon, it's easy, especially if you're a politician, which I'm not, but that people sort of would ascribe to you if they're asking questions, it's in that kind of politician way. We're not used to politicians who ask questions and are actually interested in the answers and might have like 4 or 5 follow-up questions. And so that was what really struck me about the dinner, is that things I'd got, and I should say this was after he read the book, he engaged me and asked, would I meet up with him for dinner the next time I was in Washington. So I pretended I was happening to be in Washington, that like 2 weeks later, it's like, oh yeah, as it happens, lo and behold. But when we sat down, it was, his wife and kids were in Chicago at the time. And, he had a really compressed week in DC trying to do his work so he could go home, be with his family at the weekend. So while his idea upon reading the book was, let's have this long lingering conversation about how we humanize American foreign policy, when he actually got to the dinner, he's like, I got to get home and do my thing. But then as I wrote in the book, his curiosity kind of got the better of him. So I would say things like, I'm an Irish immigrant and ended up out of college, going to Bosnia and becoming a war correspondent. And then that's how I ended up, having the question that's at the heart of this book. And he's like, wait, can we just go back in time? And how do we go from Irish immigrant to war correspondent? And I'm like, well, you're a child, like being presumptuously, presumptuous in my assumptions about him, given because I'd read, of course, on the plane, like Dreams of My Father, prep for so I had very fresh in my mind his own itinerant upbringing. And, I was like, well, I mean, when you have families and when your parents split up and there's an international component and you just learn to adapt. And he's like, yeah, but you don't go to Bosnia. I didn't go to Bosnia last I checked, and so just like, not like the kind of the silhouette narrative that we kind of define ourselves by, that goes a long way in most social settings. Just, he would have no patience for that. I mean, really trying to get at the root, I think, of what motivates people, and not what the journey has been, but sort of why and how the evolution has occurred. And so I think it really is reflected also in how he tried to govern, even though, of course, it's much more challenging when there are a lot of vectors colliding and you don't have the agency to sort of control how you deploy those curiosities.
I'm gonna ask for one more story, even though there's about 30 that I love. that I would love for you to share. There's just one more I want you to talk about, and then I want to get to present day, and what's happening. But you were, after this meeting with Obama, you raised your hand. Let me work with you. He said, I don't have any budget. I don't have. You were teaching at the time. He said, you just made it work. And it ended up opening up this whole pathway. And it wasn't that you had ambitions of working the White House. He didn't say I was running for president. You just really believed in him and his way of thinking. And along the way, you were really candid about how you had this back pain that wouldn't go away. And I think that this is a really powerful aspect of it, because by all accounts, you're teaching at Harvard, you're a Pulitzer Prize winner, you're having all of this incredible success. And you realize that this pain that you're experiencing, that's this almost paralyzing level of pain, is actually not physical. And you addressed it head on, and you were really open about how, the water Heifetz will talk about it as the waters we carry with us from our past. And you were carrying a lot of water with you from your past that you took the time as an adult to work on.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for raising that. In part, again, that's why I think opening up one's insides, as it were, or the more intimate dimensions of one's life is so important, because what I've seen since I put this book out there in the world, which was a real, because I was writing about these kinds of things, it definitely felt like a real exposure. I was very apprehensive, about any dimension of it. Does the tone and the voice, there are people who have even much more severe mental health issues. Does it, in describing mental health and trauma and what you carry often physically in your body, do you do it in a way that somehow makes it seem like there's just so many ways you can go astray in those domains. And yet I felt like we were talking about earlier, that if it's your CV that you're writing about, where's the common ground and all that? Where's the points? Where's the education of the idealist in that? And so what first started happening, Linda, and this is, and I'll get to the back pain, but was when I was in college and I had my first really great romance, was with a wonderful, now he's lives in Oklahoma with his wife and kids, but a wonderful man named John Schumann. And we went out for almost 4 years. And it was my first, I loved the guy. He was great. He loved sports just like me. We just, we had a ton in common. But not long after I started dating him or getting serious with him, for lack of a better word, I stopped being able to breathe. Like I started to feel this kind of constriction. Now, when I describe this, including in writing in the book, but many people say, oh, you're having panic attacks. And at the time also, when I would sort of try to describe, they were like, oh, you're having a panic attack. And I would say, me, and then I guess it wasn't, I don't know if there was Google back then, but I looked into like, what is it? I must have something, because it's not asthma or anything like that. But this kind of constriction. So anyway, John, my boyfriend at the time, and my dear friend to this day, invented this term for it, which he used to call lungers, because he knew that when I would start kind of yawning and just seem very constricted, it was because I was having an onset of this lungers, but it wasn't like, again, violent, or it was just a kind of residual. So, I should have looked into it, but it seemed physical. It didn't seem like it would be anything. I don't know. I now look back at my young self and think, what was I thinking? Why didn't I just go to therapy then? But instead, what I learned over the years is that when I was in really high adrenaline environments where the stress should be off the charts, like Bosnia, for example, when you're getting shelled, chances are you'd be stressed, no lungers, no constriction, right? And
Relax.
And so the most amazing thing about putting this book out in the world has been, like at book events, someone waits until the very end. They're like, I have lungers. I have exactly. And people have been telling me it's panic attack for my entire life. And I noticed it's lungers. And so John, my ex-boyfriend, has invented now this thing but the bottom line is, when between that and then, as you say, my which later would come, this debilitating back back pain. I mean, like flat out, not able to move, heating pad, icing, this, MRIs, looking, because I'm such a doctor's daughter in many ways. And I'm so, at that time was so unexamined in terms of my childhood, but I just thought I must have like slipped a disc, or I must have again, neither of these seemed, I was I've been a person who's been given all these opportunities. I've been very upbeat and full speed ahead my whole life. It had to be physical, these two things. Anyway, but then I went to therapy, and I was in deep, I was a very reluctant patient. My first therapy session with someone in Somerville, she said the very first question was, "Tell me about your father." It was like such a parody of what therapy would be. So what happens when she provokes this question, when she asks this question, which is I knew she would ask, and I knew that was one of the reasons I didn't want to go, is like, they're all the same. They're just going to ask me about my father. She asked this question in the confines of her little, studio, outpatient place or whatever. And I just started bawling. And then as I'm crying, I'm like, I just want you to know I'm crying for the following 3 reasons. I'm like trying to channel, this emotion into this framework, right? So I had some stuff to unpack, and I was, and I write a little bit about my dating life, not a thriving dating life, finding the wrong people and so forth. But as I dug into it, and it took years to really be ready to go there. But as soon as I started to understand the ramifications of having come to America, left my father behind, my father who died not long after we came here, very, very shockingly to me. And I was just carrying huge amounts of guilt and a sense of responsibility. Had we stayed, he'd still be with us, and also a huge amount of fear that if I ever love someone again, like I love my dad, that just heartache awaits, right? And so you almost subconsciously are choosing people who are not going to make you vulnerable because it'll never work. And so it all, again, sounds like kind of things that either should have been obvious or should have been quickly apparent, but it took a long time to unpack also the effects of alcoholism, on a child. And now that Linda, you and I have kids around the same age, when the superpowers that kids give to themselves, the way that all of us think that, if we were more lovable, let's say, a parent would have given up drinking, if we were worth it, right, they would have, or I could have kept my parents' marriage together had I only been a more persuasive mediator, leading to my career doing negotiations at the UN. But I mean, really, when now I'm a mother and I see how young I was, but when you're young, you don't feel young because you feel, at every age you just have the awareness you have. But then you see this little child, and so as you get older, also, and writing the book at the same time I was watching my kids get older to the ages where these big ruptures occurred in my life, I thought, I had no power in those days. And so I can't say I never get lungers, but it's both the back pain as I unpacked, and I hadn't heard the hyphets, the idea of carrying water. It's actually really resonates as a description of what one has to emit, I suppose, or at least air in some way.
And thank you for sharing this, because I think that one, it's a hard story to tell, but it's an important thing that for you to be as effective as you were as ambassador to the UN, you had to do a lot of healing. For you to have an effective, a successful and happy marriage and family, you had to do this work.
Yeah.
And it's sort of your body forced you to do it. Your body said, you know what, we need to talk. You need to let go.
That is the best description. That's exactly what was it. We need to talk. That's my back, my lungs, my entire thing. Yes.
But you did it. And that this was such you almost didn't have a choice, but it was such an investment in your strength and the peace and your ability to be a leader was to heal
Right.
these wounds. And so you had an amazing experience as a diplomat. And one of the many, many things that you did in the UN was the lesson that you learned from your mom, which was the importance of connecting with women in a male-dominated environment. And that was one of the early things you did as ambassador. I'm skipping a lot of things that you did in your career along the way, but this particular one of the earlier things that you did as UN ambassador Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I worked first at the White House as President Obama's human rights advisor, and that encompassed working on the prevention of sexual violence and women's empowerment and so forth. And as I was working on these issues and getting a huge amount of support from the president, I kind of look around and be like, wow, in national security, women aren't that empowered. At least there aren't that many of them. And so there were about 26 of us we were called senior directors, and they're the equivalent of a kind of assistant secretary, but it's sort of what drives the national security policy making. And of the 26, 6 of us only were women. And that's with a feminist president, with a wife who was once his boss, and 2 daughters and a trailblazing mother. That's Obama. And it's not like he was made, these again are in some ways decisions beneath his pay grade, but in the second term, that would all change. And he recognized that if gravity is left to deal with these kind of mid-level choices, gravity is going to go in the way that gravity goes, which is to the status quo. But in that environment where, and I'd always been solo, so gender dynamics, I can't say I was immune to them by any means, but I was a freelance writer, and I was a professor, and I was to some degree able to control my environment and insulate myself from at least some of the worst of what women in the workplace have endured, over so many years. And I also probably always compared myself to my mother, and I thought, oh gosh, I have it so much easier than she did. And so whatever, of the problematic gender dynamics that I experienced, I thought, well, it's better than what she had. And I just think I had basically been lucky for much of my career. But then suddenly I found myself in this male dominant institution, and I'm not doing that well. I'm not that effective initially at promoting human rights or getting my agenda through. And I think, well, maybe it's because I'm a rookie and I'm new to the executive branch. I've been a critic on the outside, or maybe it's because I'm doing human rights. It's pushing water uphill in any American administration. And then a female colleague of mine named Liz Sherwood Randall, who would go on to become Deputy Secretary of Energy, and may end up in a very prominent role in the Biden administration, a wonderful, talented person. She's like, you, Samantha, and the 4 other women of the 6 of us, we're meeting Wednesday night in my office. We're going to have 1 glass of wine. And bear in mind, National Security Council offices are safes. So you're literally, the office itself is a safe, like where you have to twirl it. So you go to have a glass of wine in a safe is about the most absurd thing. But we go, and all those things where I thought it was me, is it me because I'm new to government? I don't know the processes yet, or is it because my portfolio of human rights? It took 10 minutes with these other women who were working on non-proliferation and counterterrorism, and they were having the exact same experience of the workplace, feeling like their ideas were kind of landing like lead balloons in the center of the table. We all know now there's a lingo for it, amplification. Some dude makes the same point you made 15 minutes before, and it's like, oh, Bob's point. That's fascinating. What Bob is like, Bob, like, he's made that point. We could have short-circuited this meeting. So she did that. I never would have done it. I never would have done that kind of convening. So we then met every Wednesday, while we were, at least those of us who were in the country, because of course we're all traveling all around the world. And it became this amazingly empowered little group, and the size of it expanded as people moved on to different jobs. So to your question, when I got to the UN, I taking the lesson of the Wednesday group, and taking also the precedent that Madeleine Albright had set when she was UN ambassador. She had created something called the G7, which is not the group of 7, but the girl 7, because there were 7 female ambassadors back then. In my vintage, there were 37. And so I created the G37. And what she had done is have dinners and so forth. I did the same. We'd bring these women together. We'd have lunches, or we'd have meetings at the UN. I had Gloria Steinem come and talk to them. I had Katie Kay and Claire Shribman wrote this book, The Confidence Code, which all mothers of daughters should read, probably, and fathers of daughters should read, about how early it starts, where these sort of confidence gaps arise. And you could just, these UN amazing women, many of whom were the first female to ever represent their country in such high profile posts, but their realizations, right, similar to the one that I had in the Wednesday group in Washington. And so it's just amazing. It's not just that there's safety in numbers, but there's you just when you realize it's not you and you don't internalize everything and you can externalize a little bit, it is empowering. And then you also kind of know that you have these allies, not on substance, because Liz and I would disagree on what we should do about a variety of things. But, when you're tempted maybe you've made your point, nobody's embracing it, you're tempting to stand down, you just catch the eye of a female colleague across the room, or in my case, I was doing IVF while I was in the middle of the Arab Spring. And for the, in the Wednesday group, for them to know that I was going through that, you can imagine just the work-life balance.
Yeah.
It was crazy. And so I'd have to leave meetings, and like really high level meetings in the Situation Room, maybe to go get, a shot or something. And I'd like be looking at my watch and hoping the meeting would end. And then I'd get up and go. And then, one of my sisters would be like, go get them, like, and it just, to create a kind of sisterhood conspiracy a little bit. And when male colleagues were going on too long, the fact that we had self-identified as a group, but also identified together these issues and these patterns, it just gave those patterns way less force over us, way less power, like even just naming them, but also being there for one another out in the world.
It's just a beautiful that you were able to experience and then bring it forward and really initiate this to help support so many other women within the UN. And again, like you said, it doesn't mean that you're all going to agree diplomatically with each other, but just on a human level,
Right.
that you have support and friendship in a pretty tough environment. In our last 5 minutes, I would love to talk about current day, because
Sure.
you had this front row seat to everything that was going on internationally. And we've been in an administration that's been pulling back from the international stage, and we have Biden coming in now. If you were to advise Biden on, I know you can't name just one, but just sort of the top few international concerns, can you do that? And then I would love for you to talk about Ebola, because you were there for the Ebola, and I think that the parallels between your experience there. So first, if you could talk about
Yeah.
what do you wish that internationally Biden focuses on, and then if you could talk to us about your pandemic experience.
Well, there are a set of things that Biden will do that are in some ways about identity, America's identity in the world, and certainly, at least from my standpoint, about our values. And he will do many of those on day one. So there's a lot of kind of signaling. I would even say easy signaling, right? You repeal the Muslim ban, and you're signaling again to people of Muslim faith that you don't believe that they're inherent security risks, right? That they're because that was what was intended with the ban, was both to keep people out, but it was also a kind of devastating message for Muslims, even who never intended to come to the United States, to hear that we would view people just because they pray differently, that we would view them that way. Similarly, like the family separation policies, just to end that on day one. In my old realm, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, it doesn't do anything for the environment that that paperwork has been refiled at the United Nations, and we're party to the Paris Agreement. For us to be doing something about the environment, we have to be curbing our emissions at home, which takes a series of domestic regulations. But it signals, for example, to those member states in the UN that are disappearing underwater and trying to figure out, where they send their people, since no one will give their people visas in the South Pacific, for example. It signals that America's on their side and that we're back to trying to deal with this problem together. Similarly, rejoining the WHO, having pulled out at the height of a pandemic. Again, it's not rocket science that it'd be a good idea to be a part of a global health body at a time when we have a global pandemic. And again, that's just on day one. The harder question is, how do you reform the organization? How do you make it work for US interests and so forth? So those are just examples, I think, of kind of day one moves that we can expect, and I think will be important signals of who we are. Another small example just that's resonant for me, because I'm an immigrant, is the Trump administration has stripped from the US Citizenship and Immigration Services the phrase nation of immigrants. They've actually just taken it down. So, putting that back up, there things like that. That's what I mean by identity signaling Are we an inclusive and diverse country? That is a place of refuge and welcome. We're not a country with open borders, but we have these traditions that it'd be nice to harken back to. So there's that. I think that the biggest challenge, the two biggest challenges facing the new administration and any subsequent administration are China and polarization. So one, a sort of distant player power, at least geographically, but whose impact is being felt in every single domain, tech, human rights, trade, the whole question of the battle between authoritarian and democratic systems, which is a battle we've never had to fight, Linda, you or me, really, in our adult lifetimes. And that's a center stage battle now. But if we remain as polarized as we are, it's a battle. And by battle, I mean that metaphorically. There's a lot of cooperation we have to do with China on the pandemic and on climate and on so many other things. But unless we can bridge some of our divisions, or at least get on the same factual page more than we are now, we'll be in that battle with a hand tied behind our back. And so if you ask what's the biggest national security challenge threat faced by Biden, I'd say polarization, domestic polarization. Because of, and that's why Putin and President Xi and others really want to widen our divisions. That's why when they interfere, they don't just interfere in elections, they interfere on behalf of Black Lives Matter and on behalf of QAnon conspiracies. Like they're trying to amplify on behalf of anti-Black Lives Matter and on behalf of Antifa and they're trying to even take the divisions that already exist and widen them and get more people embroiled in what is happening by itself anyway. And then lastly, just on Ebola, and I know we have to go, but I would say the key lesson from ending the Ebola epidemic, and it's important because it's responsive to a misunderstanding, I think, about how the international system works that's quite widespread. The international system doesn't work on its own. It like no more than any group really works on its own, right? We've all lived in our lives and in the workplace collective action problems. You need a catalytic actor in the international system. On Ebola, that was Obama, even though Democrats and Republicans alike didn't really support what he did at the time, deploying US troops and health workers to West Africa, empowering me and John Kerry to then mobilize big global coalitions and other US diplomats, so that we were doing one piece of it. But then the UK was lead in Sierra Leone, and France was lead in Guinea, and Cuba was sending doctors, and China was building Ebola treatment units. That's how the international system works when it works. Catalytic actor need not be us, but hard to think of who else it would be in a circumstance like that, at least for now. And then leveraging our share, not to be the world's policeman, but leveraging it to get the other countries of the UN to do far more, and in that case, to end an epidemic. On COVID, the parallel steps are needed. The WHO, it's a bunch of civil servants. They don't have a single dollar or thermometer or piece of PPE, except insofar as member states are going to provide that material through their money or donations in kind. And by member states, I mean the countries of the world. And so to be back at the table at the WHO is something you have to do in order to be able to do things for the American people. But even with the vaccine coming, we are not going to be able to get back on our feet economically to really reignite the American economic engine if the pandemic is raging in places that our supply chains extend into, or where we have trade ties, or where we have family ties. So we have an interest on behalf of the security and economic welfare of the American people in leading, along with others, not owning, but leading the effort also to ensure that a vaccine is distributed globally. At the same time, of course, our priority is getting shots in the arms of the American people.
I think that, what you said, if I could just pull out what you said about the Ebola response, is that, yes, America led it, but it was a multinational, a lot of countries worked together. And because there was this coordination led by the United States and cooperation, working with countries internationally, the Ebola outbreak was contained. There was that sort of immediate response. And so for as much as people talk about, America first, part of America first is making sure that being on top of what's happening in other countries, because it can have a devastating effect here.
Yeah, I mean, you put it really well, and it is America first. I mean, Obama was America first. He ended the Ebola epidemic recognizing how many, for example, dual national Liberian Americans we have who'd be coming back and forth, who'd be bringing the virus if we didn't deal with it at its source. So yes, there's a humanitarian dimension. Of course, if you have the capacity to save lives at minimal cost, you're gonna, if you're an American president, you're gonna certainly consider very seriously whether you want to do that. But absent the nexus with also the welfare of our own people, I'm not sure if it would have gone as far as like sending the US military into West Africa, but we had to end it there, or it was going to cost American lives. That was very, very clear. And now you probably wouldn't need anything as dramatic as that. Although I would note that the president-elect, when he selected Lloyd Austin potentially to become, when he nominated him to become Secretary of Defense, he actually mentioned COVID global distribution. And so it may well be that there's a logistic component, just because, again, the US military is the top and most, at least speediest, logistic operator probably on planet Earth. But, I think that what you said, out of what I said is really important, because right now there is fatigue. Trump played into it, or has exacerbated it, but he also saw something in the American people, a kind of weariness, a sense that the rules must be working for others because they're not working for working Americans nearly enough, a kind of conflation of economic globalization with foreign policy and the downsides of economic globalization with America's international engagement, and sort of saying, well, maybe we shouldn't engage given that there have been real people who've really lost in terms of the opening up of our economies. These are related, but they are separate. And I think for the next administration to show that there are other tools in the toolbox, right, beyond the US military, because there's so much war fatigue and so much of a sense of disappointment that more hasn't been achieved in Iraq and Afghanistan. But foreign policy should very rarely be about using military force. That's really going to be an exceptional set of circumstances. I mean, the logistic role is one thing, right, here or there. But to go back to thinking about the Paris Climate Agreement, or the mobilization of the Ebola coalition, or the Iran nuclear deal, where we peacefully diffused something that could well have led to conflict, those are diplomatic tools. To think about America's campuses, our universities, which we have so many of here in Boston, as a great source of income for our economy. It's our 7th largest service sector, it turns out, education here in the US. Also, we know the vaccine itself, the product of immigrants who came here, either to study or subsequently, and all that international students, the best and the brightest who come here, offer not just our economies, but our cultures and our societies. So we have a lot of tools to lead again. And the key difference is whether you believe that the fates of the American people are linked to the fates of people living elsewhere, or you believe you can build a moat or a wall or something around us. And I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that our fates are connected to those of people elsewhere, and therefore we have an interest in performing a catalytic role, or making sure someone is, never owning it, not being the global policeman, and using the strong relationships we build with other countries to get everyone to chip in their fair share. I think Trump's insight about and emphasis on fairness is actually really important, and something that we should carry forward. But the international system was built with exactly that idea in mind, is that everybody chips in to deal with collective security challenges.
Which pandemics are part of. We ran a little bit over, but your memoir is fantastic, and you talk about the education of an idealist, and you went from better is good to shrinking the, what do you call it? Shrinking the challenge. Shrinking the change. So if you could leave us with something that you're hopeful for during this, as we are entering a pretty dark winter right now, but what is something that you can give us that you're.
Yeah. Well, I'd say there's a crisis of confidence that stems in part from polarization. I think we're all very aware of, and the election has only made us more aware of just how divided we are as a country. But to remember just the tremendous strengths that are on display, in fact, in Operation Warp Speed, right? Getting this vaccine, I mean, this will be record setting if we proceed, getting vaccines in people's arms, the civil service, the private sector, everybody coming together. Again, we're not coming together on COVID sufficiently writ large, but around the mobilization of that vaccine, I think to take from that not only relief and gratitude to those people involved, but also what's the lesson here? Return to first principles. Expertise matters. Science matters. Facts matter. In the end, because it'll still be a long while, as you say, with the long winter will extend probably into the spring, the kind of youth engagement we saw in the elections and in political campaigns that we haven't seen in years, making sure that you have that kind of youth engagement as well on COVID response and prevention. And that extends to high schools as well, where it's been really challenging, to see behavior change. But I guess the last thing I'd say, Linda, is we've seen, everything from the Me Too movement to Black Lives Matter to world sort of record shattering voter turnout in this last election, both for Biden and for Trump, and a level of civic engagement we haven't seen in this country in years, right? I mean, really off the charts. And it's just to remember that this is how America changes. We may not, I'm not thrilled about where a lot of those votes, went or whatever, because I'm a Biden supporter, but people are in this conversation now about where we're going. And we've never really changed in an enduring way, in a top-down fashion, whether it's women's rights and empowerment or civil rights, now extending into the realm of police violence and accountability and so forth. It's always kind of seized, right? And that will be true on climate if we're going to get there. It'll be citizen pressure. It'll be the private sector voting with its feet and throwing itself headlong into the clean energy shift that is needed. It's young people I see from many of them are Harvard students, or some of them are Harvard students in the gun, the measures to prevent gun violence, the effort to put in place sensible gun laws. There's a bottom-up thing that's afoot. And I think it's tempting to just see it as, oh, it's protest here, protest there. But this is what it looks like historically, right? When change is seized. And I think you will see much of that, with Obama. Some of that went away as soon as Obama was in office. It was like people had mobilized to get him elected, and then it was like handing the baton to him and his team, which I was privileged to be a part of. I think now we're not going to see much of that. I think it's feet to the fire, ongoing engagement and pressure. And that's what it has to be if we're to solve these problems.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your time, for sharing so many of your stories and insight, and for leaving us with this idealism and this hope for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. Really great to be with you.